They were the best at what they did on the silver screen. Their names become known as the best in British entertainment. But beyond the carefully produced public images and award-winning performances was a darker reality, one of brutality, deception, and behavior that would shock even the fans who loved them. This is the untold story of 13 British entertainment superstars whose behavior off-screen is very different from how great they are on screen. Before we start this trip into Hollywood's secret past, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. And we're interested to know where in the world you are and what time it is there. If it's 3 a.m. in Toronto or midnight in Manchester, let us know in the comments. We don't think this is something you usually watch in the afternoon. 1. Rex Harrison, the aristocrat of arrogance. Rex Harrison was the epitome of British style on television. He became the best example of upper-class English elegance because of his clipped speech, aristocratic demeanor, and ability to show contempt with only one raised eyebrow. In movies like My Fair Lady, he played characters that looked down on the world around them, which made him seem like he was meant to do it. The scary truth was that Harrison wasn't just acting. This was who he really was. People who worked with Harrison during the golden age of British cinema rarely recalled the experience, but not for the reasons they had hoped. Directors would politely label him deliciously difficult, but the delicious part was just Hollywood courtesy. His co-workers talked of a man who might be charming, but it was as cold as surgical steel. Harrison's approach was always the same. He would judge you, tear you apart with words, and maybe, just maybe, decide you were good enough to work with. Younger actors on the set of My Fair Lady reportedly spent their first several weeks trying to dodge his rude comments. They rapidly understood that Harrison's verbal attacks weren't just slips of the tongue out of exasperation. They were planned performances of their own. He made fun of people in a way that made them look smart and funny, showing that he was smarter than everyone else. But most of the people who laughed did so because they needed to keep their jobs. The film industry in the middle of the 20th century had a certain amount of patience with what it labeled temperamental performers. When an actor could ensure box office success, their bad behavior was called perfectionism, creative devotion, or the price of being a genius. Studios and production staff bent around Harrison like expensive furniture, being moved about to make room for a demanding guest who never thanked them for their trouble. People in the business world used euphemisms to talk about Harrison's tantrums and brutality. In Hollywood, what would be labeled bullying at any other job was dubbed temperament. The way that movies are made in a hierarchy kept him fully safe. There was no dramatic moment when the crew stood up for themselves or asked for better treatment. His legacy lives on in the history of theater and Hollywood, and his reputation is carefully protected by people who only care about his performances. But if you talk to the people who shared rehearsal spaces with him and worked with him every day, the words change a lot. They spoke about a man who was rude, full of himself, and an expert at making exquisite insults. He seemed to really enjoy breaking individuals down before evaluating if they were worth his limited patience. The irony of his most famous portrayal, Professor Henry Higgins, in My Fair Lady, is that he is a man who is consumed with teaching a lady how to talk properly, yet never really listens to her. 2. Peter Sellers, the genius who weaponized talent. Peter Sellers had a face that could look like anyone. He was a master chameleon, able to change his voice, accent, and even his whole personality with amazing accuracy. People thought that there must be deep wells of humanity underlying his performances in Dr. Strangelove, the Pink Panther series, and Being There, since they showed so many layers of talent. People who worked directly with Sellers said something completely different. Sellers was like magic on screen. People who were close to him off-screen met a man who could switch from being charming to being harsh in a matter of seconds. This wasn't the moodiness that people with artistic temperaments are known for, and it wasn't the complexity that friends might forgive. Several testimonies talk about obvious, sharp cruelty that was done on purpose and with great care. His unpredictable work habits were well known in the business. Directors worked with Sellers on films without knowing which version of the man would show up on set. Might it be the lovely collaborator, the checked-out professional who is just going through the motions, or the catastrophically hostile person who might throw off the whole production schedule? Crew members heard reports about him getting angry on set, walking off at the last minute when his demands weren't satisfied, and playing mind games that were almost like manipulation. One event that really stood out was how director Billy Wilder reacted when Sellers had a heart issue. Wilder's quip, "You have to have a heart before you can have an attack," wasn't meant to be funny. It was a professional obituary disguised as a joke, written by someone who had seen Sellers' behavior firsthand. Sellers' devastation went far beyond the workplace. His relationships with other people were like a list of things that went wrong. Former spouses and separated children consistently depicted a guy who perceived emotional closeness as a threat, necessitating eradication. He burnt bridges so often and in such a systematic way that one wonders if he liked the devastation itself. He had a defined pattern. After an intense outburst, he would make grand, deceptive apologies to start the cycle over again. The obvious question is, why didn't someone step in? The answer tells you everything you need to know about entertainment values in the middle of the century. Sellers was quite smart. He made a lot of money for studios. The tortured clown myth was nevertheless quite popular, even when the clown was performing the torturing instead of going through it. When Sellers injured individuals, it added to his mystique instead of being seen as severe career or personal failures. He donned difficult genius as readily as he wore a phony mustache or a character outfit. When Sellers died, he left behind a legacy as a great actor and a well-liked person, even though no one ever saw how he treated the people who worked with him. He never had to face the anguish he had created, and he never thought about it at the end of his career. People were mostly afraid of him, but they didn't say anything about it because of how talented he was. 3. Oliver Reed, chaos personified. Oliver Reed never lied to anyone about who he was. He showed up to every set and interview just as promised, loud, unpredictable, and with a look on his face that said he found other people's suffering funny. There was no pretending to be polite or secretive. You got the full experience of machismo, with all the fighting, bragging, and alcohol. If it caused difficulties for cast or crew members, it was up to them to deal with them. Reed was a walking bar fight in a time when leading males were expected to look at least a little bit sophisticated. By the end of the 1960s, his reputation had gone beyond being colorful and into very dangerous area. The stories weren't just rumors that people spoke about behind the scenes. They were newspaper headlines, police reports, and scars that could be seen. After a brawl in a bar, he needed more than 60 stitches. Another time, he was so drunk when he got to the set that he thought a prop wall was a real building. The turmoil was real at moments and performance art at other times. Reed knew that the producers wanted him to act like a demon, and he was more than happy to give them what they wanted. But reports about drinking off-screen are only part of the story. Reed might be mean, pushy, and bossy on set. He really liked to scare people, especially when he felt threatened or challenged. No one was safe from his actions, not even women, younger performers, or crew members. Some people said he becomes softer with time, while others hoped he would just forget they were there. There are reports of talk show appearances where somebody spoke sexist things and tried to get people angry on purpose. It was definitely a circus act, but it hurt everyone else who was there. There are still a lot of people who support Reed. They typically say that he is a misunderstood rebel who hates pretension and is like an old-fashioned male anti-hero. They say things like roguish charm and pub legend to make excuses for conduct that hurt people. But we're not looking at charm here. This was chaos wrapped in a pretty wrapper with enough skill to keep real problems at bay all the time. And did those repercussions ever really happen? Reed kept working, drinking, and pushing limits until one eventually pushed back in a way he couldn't ignore. The fact that the business put up with Reed shows that talent and box office potential can make almost any behavior okay. His notoriety wasn't a secret. It was part of his brand, which he deliberately built up and promoted to those who expected their entertainment figures to be larger than life in every way. 4. Richard Burton, the voice that drowned in bottles. Richard Burton has a voice that could really stop time. It was deep, rich, and sonorous, and it could make Shakespeare seem better or sell things just as well. He could make queens fall in love with him or read the writing on a cereal box and make it sound deep. But beneath that beautiful voice was a man who was slowly drowning under the weight of his own reputation, taking a few people down with him. People who knew him called him intelligent, fascinating, and tragic. Crew members and co-stars who worked with him every day used words like unpredictable, antagonistic, and occasionally impossible. Burton didn't have to make hell as Oliver Reed did. He drank a lot, sulked a lot, was always late, and slurred his words all the time. He could go from charming to angry in the time it took to start a cigarette. By the middle of the 1970s, Burton was said to have drunk so much that he had to sit or lie down while filming The Klansman. Later, he said he had no recall of making the movie at all. This wasn't a method acting or profound character absorption. It was a full breakdown of the workplace caught on film. Many people who support Burton would say that he was a man who was haunted by demons. They talk about the stress that comes with being famous, the psychological toll of feeling guilty about being working class in an aristocratic milieu, and the tragedy of being too smart to accept his own success. None of these reasons explain why co-workers always said she was frigid. There were harsh verbal attacks, monologues of self-pity between takes, and several documented cases of him purposefully destroying co-stars when he felt threatened in his job. But the industry gave him full support. Burton wasn't merely a good performer, he was also a big draw at the ticket office. He was Burton, one half of the Burton-Taylor phenomenon, a walking tabloid soap opera that got a lot of attention. People seemed to watch him more the louder his personal problems got. His mood swings weren't disguised or tidied up. They were a part of the story of his career. His drinking problem became part of the story of the tortured genius. People said that the harshness, the tantrums, and the mood swings were all because they were too deep, too intense, and too Welsh, as if being Welsh and profound were reasons for bad behavior at work. When someone routinely messes up production schedules or systematically destroys a co-star's confidence, depth is a very bad excuse. There was no denying that Burton was talented, but there was also no denying that he left behind a trail of broken co-workers and messed up productions. 5. Peter O'Toole, the gentleman hellraiser. Peter O'Toole lived his life like a man who knew the rules didn't apply to him, and he was generally right. He was impossibly tall and had a voice that could make a parking ticket sound like Shakespearean verse. He played monarchs, prophets, and rogues with equal skill. But O'Toole's best role could have been playing himself, the last of the gentleman hellraisers. Journalists loved him, producers were scared of him, and everyone else who had to work with him only put up with him on rare occasions. He repeated these stories a lot, and according to him, his life was like walking a tightrope between genius and madness. The stories mix together truth and fiction so much that they don't make sense anymore. People say that he once rode a camel into a bar. The time he forgot what country he was in while filming. The long afternoons that turned into longer nights, which ended with someone else taking care of both the money and the damage. Few people ever stopped to check if he was lying or not. O'Toole had a presence that made it seem rude to not believe him. O'Toole wasn't only fueled by alcohol, like his pal and drinking buddy Richard Burton. He seemed to be made of it. His co-workers talked about long drinking sessions, crazy rehearsals, jokes that went on for hours, and a love of anarchy that left sets in states of barely contained turmoil. But the wildness wasn't always fun or safe. He could be unpredictable, hard to deal with, and even mean in the way that smart people can be when they think no one else in the room matters or lives up to their expectations. This wasn't just a story or an exaggerated legend. It was something that really happened at work. Directors sighed and went along with it. Teams changed the way they worked to fit him. Everyone assured themselves that the trouble was worth it for the performance they would eventually get. He was amazing when he was at his peak, after all. O'Toole had a way of taking over scenes without seeming to try, which was good because many people said he didn't like traditional rehearsal methods. People say that he became calmer in his final years, or at least that's what well-planned interviews said. But by then, the damage, both at work and at home, had already been done to the people around him. People clapped and praised O'Toole. The cleanup and recovery were done by everyone else. O'Toole's anarchy came with a grin in his eye, a lovely sign that he knew exactly what he was doing. But what if the damage comes in a perfectly fitted tuxedo with a raised eyebrow and a raised fist when needed and no regret after? 6. Sean Connery, the icon with troubling views. Sean Connery didn't act. He ruled the place he was in. He had an unusual mix of working-class steel and aristocratic swagger, like a nightclub bouncer who had learned how to say Chablis correctly. As James Bond, he was everything men aspired to be, and everything women were both drawn to and warned about. Charming, dangerous, cool, and, as it turns out, not exactly a model citizen when the cameras stopped rolling. There was always a veil of inconsistency over Connery's behavior off-screen. He was very secretive about his personal life, yet he didn't seem to care about stating the quiet portions out loud in public. He said in a 1965 interview with Playboy magazine that it was okay to hit a woman in some situations. Years later, when asked about these comments, he didn't take them back or say he had been misquoted. He did it again. There was obviously some criticism, but there were other people who praised him for being a stronghold of old-school manhood against modern sensibilities. It seemed like that phrase, masculinity, followed Connery around all the time, but when you looked at the specifics more closely, it wasn't always in a good way. Some of Connery's supporters have said that he was just a product of his time, a harsh man from a hard past who was misread through modern eyes. But time doesn't really change who a person is. It merely changes the reasons we provide for their actions. People in the industry often say that he is cold, controlling, and likely to act like a bully, both on and off set. People didn't know him as someone who gave people second chances or made things easier for them when they let him down. Co-stars talked about him with a mix of real respect and clear tiredness. He made every scene more serious, and sometimes he brought a storm cloud to every show. People told stories about fights, him pulling rank, and fights about ego that were artfully disguised as professional or creative disagreements. Connery, like many stars of his level, didn't have to answer for any of this very often. The studio bosses forgiven him, the audience forgot, and the box office results were enough to keep him working. Long after his Bond years were over, he was still a huge cultural figure. In carefully planned interviews, he became a grandfatherly figure, full of wisdom and warmth for the audience. But the shadows didn't go away. They merely wore better-fitting clothes and spoke more calmly. 7. Laurence Olivier, theatrical tyranny. Laurence Olivier didn't just act. He also declared, thundered, brooded, and commanded. Olivier was Britain's theatrical royalty incarnate. He was a knight of the stage long before the Queen made it official with awards. He played Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III, and it seemed like he was like them in real life as well. Olivier was a brilliant technical performer, but he was also very egotistical and entitled. He wasn't just a wonderful artist. He was a man who thought everyone should always agree with that, both on set and in silence. No one ever doubted Olivier's genius, but his dictatorship was a whole different story. People who worked with him told stories that all showed him as a man who could be rude, condescending, and very dismissive. He was well known for hating method acting, which he said was an American luxury for insecure amateurs who didn't have the right training. Olivier's dislike for Marilyn Monroe was so strong during the making of The Prince and the Showgirl, which he directed and starred in, that it was almost like a second character in the movie. He made fun of Monroe's acting method, her delays, and her worry, not realizing that he was making around half of that anxiety worse by acting the way he did. One quote sums up both the change and the harm quite well. When Monroe had trouble with a certain scenario, Olivier is said to have snapped, "Why don't you just try acting?" When taken out of context, it sounds funny. In the real world, it was quite hard. It shows a man who not only didn't have patience, but also didn't seem to be really interested in other ways of doing things, using vulnerability as a tool or anyone else's way of functioning. He wasn't there to work together as an equal. He was there to be obeyed as a boss. You may call this the actor-manager complex, which comes from a time when famous actors operated their own theater companies. Olivier was the perfect example of this. He wasn't just the star actor on any shoot, he was the boss. You didn't tell him what to do, you worked around him like an obstacle. Some actors saw him as a master, but others quietly left shows with frayed nerves and broken confidence. Was he always like this? Not exactly. Friends said that he could be kind, charming, and even self-deprecating when the time was right. But at the workplace, the urge to be in charge usually won. When things went wrong, he always blamed the person closest to him. 8. Kenneth Williams, the miserable treasure. Kenneth Williams was a national treasure with a sharp tongue. Williams was campy, intelligent, and, as he often said, quite unhappy. He is most known for his work in the Carry On films and his constant presence on British radio. He had the voice of a vaudeville angel and the personality of someone who was always stuck in a room with people who didn't get the joke or weren't good enough to hear it done well. He was a one-man comedy machine in public, with over-the-top facial expressions, snappy one-liners, and a complete understanding of double entendre. People say he was hard to work with behind the scenes, and he was often tired. His famous journals, which were published after his death and are thousands of pages lengthy, are mostly a record of his anger. He hated directors, co-stars, fans, and himself. He was probably asleep if he wasn't angry over something or someone. The diary writings go from hating yourself to angrily criticizing other people. Diaries are private, but the sheer amount of bile made it easier for the public to understand how bad it could be to be around him. His co-stars described how he would sulk on set, how his moods could change at any moment, and how it always seemed like no one knew which version of Kenneth Williams would show up each day. He was funny at times. Sometimes he was poison wrapped in a scarf. He could destroy someone with just one line, not for fun or comedy, but as a reflexive type of social violence. His fears often hurt the people around him, who he pretended were high standards or refined taste. If you were younger, more sure of yourself, or just too hopeful about life, there was a good chance he would have cut you down before lunch. Of course, it wasn't just mean. He was really sad all the time, and he probably felt quite alone, which probably made him bitter. Williams was a man who was always out of step with his time, his celebrity, and maybe even himself. But in the workplace, empathy didn't fix the damage that had already been done. Williams destroyed a lot of bridges, whether he was putting down co-workers or making fun of the very shows that paid his rent in public. He presumably wrote about each one in his diary for dramatic effect and for future generations. 9. Patrick McGoohan, the visionary tyrant. Patrick McGoohan didn't just star in television, he dominated it with piercing gaze, clipped speech, and theatrical intensity that seemed to vibrate at a different frequency than everyone around him. He wasn't merely acting, he was commanding realities into existence. Best known as the enigmatic number 6 in The Prisoner, McGoohan didn't just lead the show, he was the show in every sense. Creator, producer, star, and self-appointed philosophical architect. If you were in his orbit, you weren't a collaborator. You were a variable in his private chess game. On screen, McGoohan was electric, mesmerizing. Off screen, he was reportedly combative, controlling, and obsessed with ideological purity to a degree that bordered on mania. The stories emerging from the making of The Prisoner are less fun behind-the-scenes anecdotes and more cautionary tales about what happens when creative genius becomes a one-person authoritarian regime. Crew members described an atmosphere of perpetual unease. Scripts were rewritten at the last possible minute. Scenes were abruptly canceled mid-production. Entire episodes were restructured because McGoohan had decided the philosophical underpinnings weren't sufficiently tight or meaningful. To be fair, the man possessed a compelling vision. He didn't want The Prisoner to be a typical spy adventure series. He wanted it to be an existential meditation on identity, surveillance, and resistance. But the process of creating it was often pure chaos. Writers were routinely dismissed when their work didn't match his vision. Directors found themselves overridden on fundamental decisions. Even actors discovered what their characters would be doing approximately halfway through filming, assuming the script hadn't changed again in the interim. One production manager likened working with him to being trapped in a village of his own making, which poetically was exactly the plot of the show itself. It wasn't limited to The Prisoner. McGoohan's perfectionism followed him throughout his career. From guest roles in Columbo to various film appearances, he earned a consistent reputation as difficult, a term that often means won't let the studio win, but in his case also meant colleagues should brace themselves for inevitable clashes. He could be brilliant, unquestionably, but he could also be brutal about imposing that brilliance on everyone around him. Still, to many viewers and critics, McGoohan remains a hero of uncompromising television, a man who refused to dilute his artistic vision even if that meant alienating half the crew. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to make statements that would endure. 10. Alec Guinness, Elegant Disdain. Alec Guinness possessed the kind of gravitas that made everything feel important, even when it objectively wasn't. His presence could transform comedy into philosophy, could turn a stiff military uniform into something approaching tragic. He was the high priest of British restraint, the quiet storm. But behind the carefully cultivated, dignified exterior existed a man known for sharp opinions, deep reservations, and a famously frosty relationship with almost everything he considered beneath his standards, which included Star Wars, especially Star Wars. Guinness's performance as Obi-Wan Kenobi remains legendary in cinema history. His personal feelings about it were legendarily sour. In private letters, he referred to the dialogue as rubbish, the story as juvenile, and the fans as a bewildering species best avoided at all costs. One of the most infamous anecdotes involves him allegedly agreeing to give a child an autograph on the strict condition that the boy never watch Star Wars again. Some claim he was joking. Others who were present weren't laughing, but the disdain wasn't exclusively about science fiction. Guinness carried a reputation for cultural snobbery that bled directly into his professional demeanor. Directors and co-stars described him as formal to the point of iciness. He didn't shout or throw tantrums in the manner of other difficult stars, but he also didn't hide his disappointment when he believed material was beneath his capabilities. And most material was beneath his self-assessed capabilities. This wasn't the flamboyant cruelty of an Oliver Reed or the control obsession of a Patrick McGoohan. Guinness's version of difficult was a slow drip of condescension. He brought moods down, not with fire, but with frost. His sarcasm could flatten a conversation completely. His indifference could vacuum energy from an entire room. Some actors felt genuinely honored to work with him. Others quietly admitted they found the experience exhausting, like being constantly judged in Latin by a headmaster who never blinked or smiled. To be fair, Guinness was a product of a different theatrical tradition, one where seriousness meant avoiding anything colorful, commercial, or emotionally available to audiences. But that seriousness came with substantial cost. His relationship with audiences, especially later in life, became increasingly strained. He wanted reverence, not fandom. He preferred being quoted from The Bridge on the River Kwai, not asked to say, "Use the Force," for the 10,000th time. The public saw robes and wisdom. Only those who worked closely with him saw the man who loathed the very stardom he'd helped create through his own exceptional talent. 11. Joan Collins, the strategic diva. Joan Collins never pretended to be low maintenance or easy to work with. From the moment she strode into Hollywood in the 1950s with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, she treated stardom like a full-contact sport. By the time she became Alexis Carrington on Dynasty, she wasn't just playing a diva. She was method acting one in real time. If you found yourself on the opposite side of that confidence, you felt its full force. Collins has consistently insisted that what some people label difficult, she calls professional. She wanted proper lighting, proper lines, proper wardrobe, and proper respect, demands that sound reasonable until you hear them from people who worked alongside her. Dynasty sets were famous for being war zones of competing egos, and Collins was frequently holding the megaphone. Stories from that era form a complicated tangle of feuds, power plays, and thinly veiled insults, all conducted amid hairspray clouds and champagne flutes. Some of it was playful professional rivalry. Some of it, decidedly, was not. Her most publicized clash involved co-star Linda Evans, the on-screen rival who became an off-screen lightning rod. Interviews conducted decades later still sound like unresolved therapy sessions, with each side convinced the other was the primary instigator. Collins leaned into the chaos, branding herself as the glamorous villain both in character and in reality. That persona made her substantial money. It also gave everyone else persistent headaches. But the diva behavior wasn't limited to the soap opera circus. Earlier in her career, Collins was already known for strong-arming producers, demanding script changes, and refusing to be sidelined or diminished. In an industry that expected women to be grateful for any opportunity, she demanded power instead. That was brave and groundbreaking. It was also, at times, genuinely abrasive to those around her. Colleagues didn't always feel empowered by her assertiveness. Some felt bulldozed by it. The line between strong woman and difficult star has always been unfairly blurry, especially for women in entertainment. Collins has lived inside that contradiction for decades. Even sympathetic accounts admit she could be cutting, calculating, and ruthlessly strategic when her status was threatened. This wasn't someone content to play nice. This was someone determined to win at any cost. And she did win. She outlasted rivals, outmaneuvered critics, and turned scandal into personal branding long before social media figured out how to monetize outrage. But that kind of survival leaves casualties, reputations bruised, relationships burned, sets left tense and exhausted in her wake. 12. Diana Dors. Scandal as currency. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Hollywood's bombshells. Blonde, bold, and never quite where anyone expected or wanted her to be. In the 1950s, she was marketed as a sex symbol, a siren with a wicked grin, and a headline-ready lifestyle that kept tabloids in business. But behind the glossy promotional photos and studio publicity existed a woman whose real life often resembled a runaway train, more than a red carpet procession. Dors understood the power of scandal better than most of her contemporaries. In an industry that desperately wanted to control its stars like puppets, she leaned deliberately into unpredictability. Parties spilled into newspaper coverage. Affairs became front-page fodder. Every wild story, every outrageous rumor only made her more famous and exponentially more difficult to manage. Studios hated it. The public couldn't consume it fast enough. But that fame came with serious consequences. Dors developed an industry-wide reputation for being unreliable, impulsive, and at times recklessly self-sabotaging in ways that damaged her own career prospects. There were legal troubles, including a highly publicized theft conviction involving stolen bottles of liquor, not a career-ending incident, but another visible crack in the carefully polished image studios tried to maintain. Producers worried about hiring her. Publicists scrambled constantly to keep up with her latest incident. Directors quietly braced themselves whenever her name appeared on a call sheet. Was she a menace in the aggressive sense of some men on this list? Not exactly, but she was disruptive in ways that rattled the industry's foundations. She refused to be neat. She refused to behave according to prescribed rules. That made her simultaneously fascinating and absolutely exhausting to work with. Some colleagues saw a clever woman masterfully playing the publicity game on her own terms. Others saw a star spiraling under the crushing weight of being constantly watched, judged, and commodified. In later years, Dors transformed into more of a media personality than a movie star, narrating her own chaos with humor and a strange kind of brutal honesty. But the damage to her career had been done. Her early promise had been swallowed by spectacle, and the industry that built her was remarkably quick to step back when the mess became inconvenient or unprofitable. Yet even within that mess, she remained unforgettable, a symbol of how fame, when mixed with volatility and lack of institutional support, can transform a promising career into a cautionary tale. 13. George Sanders, Elegant Cruelty. George Sanders didn't play villains. He embodied them so completely that the distinction became meaningless. With that velvet baritone voice and eyebrows permanently arched in aristocratic disdain, he made arrogance seem like a legitimate art form. Whether he was scheming in All About Eve or suavely narrating his own indifference to human connection, Sanders brought to the screen a persona so polished, so drolly heartless, that audiences naturally assumed it must be autobiographical. Inconveniently for everyone who knew him personally, it essentially was. Unlike many actors on this list, Sanders didn't have to manufacture aloofness or perform detachment. He came by both naturally. Co-stars described him as indifferent at best, actively rude at worst. He had a well-documented reputation for being selfish, deeply cynical, and utterly bored by the very idea of pretending to care what anyone else thought about anything. Charm was his weapon, certainly, but he wielded it like a surgeon's scalpel, surgically precise but rarely warm. Directors extracted what they needed from him, but not much more. Emotion, enthusiasm, genuine collaboration. Those were someone else's department, never his. He was notoriously lazy on set, often delivering what industry insiders call phoned-in performances whenever he decided the script was beneath his capabilities. To be fair to Sanders, most scripts were beneath his considerable talents, but his disdain wasn't loud or theatrical in presentation. It was dry and quietly poisonous, the kind of disdain you couldn't effectively argue against because it was always delivered with an urbane smile. He was rarely cruel in showy, dramatic ways. He simply didn't think most people, or their work, were worth his effort. The line between his roles and his reality blurred constantly and deliberately. Sanders once admitted in an interview that he saw himself as a man who enjoys making others unhappy. Unlike other stars who had publicity teams scrambling to clean up such statements, Sanders seemed to relish his own negative press. He cultivated his persona like a carefully tended garden, feeding it with cynicism, watering it with sarcasm, and methodically pruning away anything that might be mistaken for sincerity. Still, he remained magnetic to audiences. That was the fundamental problem. People wanted desperately to believe there was more underneath. A wounded soul, a misunderstood genius, a misanthrope, with a heart buried under layers of protective irony. But most reliable accounts suggest there wasn't any hidden depth. Sanders was simply exactly what he appeared to be: elegant, brilliant, deeply self-involved, and completely uninterested in changing for anyone's benefit. His story doesn't conclude with redemption. There's no tearful reflection, no third-act transformation where he sees the error of his ways. Just a man who fit perfectly into a world of shadows and silk, who left behind a trail of side-eyes and second-hand anecdotes that still make actors wince when they hear them. George Sanders didn't just burn bridges in his wake. He looked devastatingly good doing it, and that somehow made it worse. These 13 British entertainment legends shared extraordinary talent and troubling patterns of behavior that the industry chose to tolerate, excuse, or actively enable. Their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about how the entertainment world has historically valued box office returns and artistic brilliance over basic human decency and professional conduct. The golden age of British cinema and television produced unforgettable performances that continue to influence entertainment today. But behind those performances were real people, crew members, co-stars, staff, who absorbed the daily reality of working with individuals whose talent seemed to justify any behavior, no matter how destructive. Understanding these histories doesn't diminish the art these performers created. It does, however, provide essential context about the human cost of that art and raises important questions about what we're willing to excuse in the name of genius. What are your thoughts? Did any of these stories surprise you? Share your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into entertainment history's hidden.